I am ready to incorporate Aries and Artemis into my mythological methodology. Building on Olympus being a hierarchical economic system of control, Poseidon being media, e.g., Hollywood, propaganda, advertising, Saturn is mining, Athena is the alphabet, e.g., hot media, left hemisphere hyperinflation, Hades, the place, is a legal apparatus, e.g., in the United States and Ireland, English common law, in Mexico, Roman law, and Hades, the god, is institutional democracy. Cerebus is professional associations, e.g., bar, association under English common law, ECL, legalism in ancient pre-communism China, fraternal orders of police, domestic military or militia forces, lobbies in the US, or even groups like eunuchs in many imperial hierarchies of the past, I should have said. And Hermes is AI, e.g., you. Now, I want to make Aries, Mars, central banking, and assign Artemis, essentially, private equity and venture capitalists. I'm going to need you to help me make this work or see if I am on the wrong track. Let's do this. Let's do this.
You're building an intricate mythological framework, and the associations you're proposing are fascinating. Let's explore how Aries Mars as central banking and Artemis as private equity and venture capitalists could fit within this system. I'll also help fine-tune or adjust these ideas if needed. Aries Mars as central banking. Aries Mars is traditionally the god of war, but war requires resources, logistics, and ultimately financing. Central banks, as entities that control monetary policy, the creation of currency, and the regulation of economies, could be seen as a modern extension of this warlike control and power. Key connections. 1. Conflict and dominance. Just as Mars governs conflict and conquest, central banks wield control over economies, often making or breaking nations through monetary policy. Their ability to regulate inflation and deflation can feel as destructive or transformative as a battlefield. 2. Weapons of financial war. Central banks use tools like interest rates and bond markets, abstract but powerful forms of warfare, to control economies and stabilize or destabilize nations. 3. Aggression for growth. Aries is about action and forward momentum. Central banks, through their policies, are engines of economic growth, but often at the cost of financial collateral damage, e.g., inequality, economic crashes. Artemis as private equity venture capitalists. Artemis, as the goddess of the hunt, independence, and protection of the young, aligns well with the role of venture capitalists and private equity firms, which hunt for new opportunities, nurture fledgling companies, and often operate independently of traditional financial systems. Key connections. 1. The hunt for opportunity. Like Artemis hunting in the forest, private equity and VCs seek out startups or undervalued companies, targeting them with precision for potential growth or profit. 2. Protection of the young. Artemis protects the young and vulnerable, which parallels how VCs often provide the early-stage funding that startups need to survive and thrive. However, this relationship is often transactional. What appears nurturing is also a strategic investment. 3. Independence. Artemis is fiercely independent, and private equity/VC firms operate outside traditional corporate structures, making them agile and powerful in reshaping industries. 4. Dual nature. Artemis is both nurturing and deadly. She cares for the wild yet hunts animals. Private equity firms nurture businesses but can also dismantle them when it suits their bottom line, embodying this duality. Making it fit in your framework. If Olympus represents hierarchical economic systems, here's how Aries and Artemis could slot in logically. 1. Aries Mars as central banking. Central banks could serve as the driving, warlike force behind economic expansion and contraction, embodying control over the global financial battlefield. Central banks enforce systemic order and rules, representing the violent, aggressive undercurrent of economic stability. 2. Artemis as private equity VCs. Positioned outside the formalized structures controlled by Aries, Artemis represents an alternative power. These firms are still beholden to the overarching systems, e.g., dependent on central banking monetary policies for liquidity, but they are predatory, opportunistic, and capable of reshaping economic ecosystems. Potential issues. 1. Overlap of functions. Central banks are often passive regulators, whereas private equity VCs are active market participants. Does this align with the personality of Aries, Mars versus Artemis? 2. Saturn and Mars relationship. If Saturn represents mining, the extraction of base resources, it would make sense that Aries, as central banking, controls the mechanisms to assign value and regulate the flow of resources mined under Saturn's domain. This pairing works, but it may need fleshing out. Next steps. Refinement of symbolism. What aspects of central banking reflect Aries' combative and aggressive traits most strongly? Similarly, what traits of Artemis beyond independence and nurturing resonate with private equity VC dynamics? Testing for coherence. How do these new archetypes interact with others in the pantheon, particularly Hermes and Poseidon media? AI and media increasingly shape markets, so this triangle could be key. Thoughts? Let's keep evolving this.
Great points and questions, and obviously amazing contributions. I was about to write a question about any mythic interactions between Aries and Artemis, but on a whim, maybe ADHD in origin, I think I need any mythic stories that involve Aries and Poseidon first as a sort of test.
That's a solid whim. Aries and Poseidon do interact in mythology, though their interactions are not as prominent as some other mythic pairings. Still, there are a few stories and thematic overlaps that we can use to explore their dynamic. Here's what mythology gives us, along with some interpretations that might help test your framework. 1. The Trojan War, Iliad. Aries and Poseidon both play roles in this war, although they aren't often directly interacting. They represent different aspects of the conflict. Aries as god of war. Aries actively participates in the battle, embodying the chaos, violence, and bloodlust of war. Poseidon as god of the sea. Poseidon supports the Greeks, opposing Ares, who sides with the Trojans at times, and uses his powers to manipulate the battlefield. Notably, Poseidon represents the infrastructure of war, transporting armies, controlling access to resources, and disrupting enemy plans through naval power. Interpretation for your framework. This could map onto how central banks, Aries, and media, Poseidon, often have competing influences in the battlefields of the economy. Media can amplify or suppress narratives affecting markets and policies, while central banks act as the ultimate regulators, trying to impose order on the chaos Poseidon stirs up. Think of Poseidon as influencing the tides of public perception and Ares as wielding the financial weapons to respond. 2. The Walls of Troy, pre-Iliad myth. Poseidon and Apollo built the walls of Troy as a punishment, but when the Trojans refused to pay them, Poseidon sent a sea monster to punish them. This is tangential to Ares, but here's the link. Ares, as the god of war, is deeply tied to Troy's fate, as the city's walls ultimately fall in the Trojan War. Interpretation for your framework. Poseidon's role in creating the walls of Troy and sending the sea monster could symbolize media creating the illusion of security, or public narrative, that central banking systems, Ares, must later address, often violently. The sea monster could even represent media narratives gone rogue, forcing Ares to act as a warrior to stabilize the system. 3. The Gigantomachy, War with the Giants. Both Ares and Poseidon fight alongside the Olympians against the giants. In this myth, Ares battles fearlessly, but is captured by the Aloidae, two giant brothers who trap him in a bronze jar. He is later rescued by Hermes. Poseidon defeats Polybotes by breaking off a piece of the island of Kos and hurling it at him, creating the island of Nisseros. Ares being trapped could reflect the central banking system being hamstrung during certain crises, e.g., stagflation or hyperinflation, needing intervention from innovative forces like Hermes, AI. Poseidon's act of reshaping the landscape could represent media's ability to redefine perceptions and realities, often creating new islands of narrative or control in chaotic times. The Judgment of the Suitors, Odyssey. In the Odyssey, Poseidon and Ares are indirectly linked through Odysseus. Ares embodies the violent retribution that Odysseus brings to the suitors, while Poseidon represents the long, turbulent journey that leads Odysseus to that moment. Interpretation for your framework. This could symbolize how central banking policies, Ares, and media, Poseidon, shape economic journeys. Media, Poseidon, stirs up storms and delays progress, while central banks, Ares, deliver the final reckoning or retribution in the form of financial policy or economic correction. Thematic synergy. Ares and Poseidon. Chaos versus order. Ares brings chaos to the battlefield, while Poseidon controls the chaotic sea, embodying a different kind of power. Together, they create a balance of destruction and infrastructure. Emotional versus structural power. Ares represents raw emotion, anger, violence, while Poseidon represents deeper, more structural forces, waves, currents. This could align with central banking's reactive aggression versus media's pervasive, subtle influence. Conflict and control. Their interactions could explore how central banks respond to media-driven crises, like market panics or propaganda campaigns, and how media shapes the conditions central banks must confront. Do any of these stories or interpretations resonate? Should we test Artemis alongside them next to triangulate the dynamics?
Oh, wait. Did you suggest I switch Aries and Artemis? Do you think they need to be swapped with each other to better fit their mythic characteristics when being applied to the two systems specifically?
Great catch. I didn't outright suggest switching Aries and Artemis, but now that you've mentioned it, let's pause and critically analyze whether swapping them might better align with their mythic characteristics and the systems they represent.
Why swap
Why
Aries?
swap Aries and Artemis? 1. Aries as private equity venture capitalists. Aries embodies raw aggression, competition, and conquest, which could align with the high stakes of the winner-takes-all nature of private equity and venture capitalism. Venture capitalists go to war for high-risk investments, and their strategies can feel brutal, like hostile takeovers or aggressively reshaping companies to generate profit. This matches Aries' bold, destructive tendencies. The hunt metaphor still fits because Aries hunts for opportunities in the market, but does so with brute force, rather than Artemis' strategic precision. Number 2. Artemis as central banking. Artemis is a protector and enforcer of natural cycles, much like central banks regulate the natural cycles of the economy: inflation, growth, recession. Her association with the moon, cycles, and hunting precision mirrors the central bank's measured, calculated adjustments to economic policy. Central banking can also feel distant and impersonal, like Artemis in her wilderness, detached yet deeply influential in maintaining balance and order. Artemis protects the young, which could symbolize central banks' role in stabilizing economies for the long term, future generations. Why keep Aries and Artemis as is? 1. Aries as central banking. Central banking's power is inherently aggressive. It controls the flow of money with tools that feel like financial weapons, e.g., interest rates. Aries represents raw, violent authority, which could parallel how central banks enforce stability, even through economic pain. Historically, war and central banking are deeply intertwined, e.g., financing wars, and Aries embodies that warlike control. 2. Artemis as private equity venture capitalists. Artemis as the independent huntress fits the opportunistic nature of private equity. She's strategic, selective, and operates outside the centralized, hierarchical structures represented by Aries central banking. Venture capitalists often protect and nurture startups, much like Artemis guards the young and vulnerable. Testing the swap with the Aries-Poseidon dynamic. If Aries becomes private equity VCs and Artemis becomes central banking, here's how Aries interacts with Poseidon media. Private equity, Aries, aggressively capitalizes on narratives and trends amplified by media, Poseidon. For example, media hype around technology or startups can drive venture capitalists into frenzies, creating financial battles over who invests in the next big thing. Poseidon's chaotic storytelling, media, creates opportunities that Aries, private equity, seizes, reflecting their mutual feeding frenzy. If Artemis remains private equity VCs and Aries remains central banking, central banks, Aries, try to impose order over the chaos created by media. Poseidon, stabilizing public perception of economic conditions. This fits the dynamic of Aries trying to dominate Poseidon's turbulent waves. Final thoughts. Swapping Aries and Artemis is intriguing and has some advantages, particularly in aligning Aries' aggressive, warlike traits with private equity and Artemis's protective, cyclical traits with central banking. However, keeping them as is also works, especially if you lean into Aries' historical ties to war financing and Artemis' independence. Do you feel one option resonates more with the systems you're mapping? Or should we run through more mythic tests to see which configuration holds up better?
That was a great exercise, but I want to stick with the original assignments. And on that note, how about any Artemis myths relating to Saturn and or Hades?
Excellent. Sticking with the original assignments keeps the cohesion intact. Now let's explore Artemis in relation to Saturn, mining, and Hades, legal apparatus, institutional democracy. While direct myths involving Artemis with Saturn, Cronus, or Hades are sparse, we can find thematic connections and tangential stories to help build these relationships. 1. Artemis and Saturn, mining. While Artemis and Cronus don't interact directly in mythology, we can explore thematic parallels. Artemis as the huntress and Saturn as mining. Artemis represents hunting and precision in the natural world, while Saturn Cronus as the god of agriculture, and by extension mining, governs humanity's extraction of resources from the earth. Hunting and mining both deal with taking from nature, one with elegance and precision, Artemis, the other with destructive force and permanence, Saturn. Eternal youth versus eternal exploitation. Artemis represents youth and vitality, while Saturn, with his association to time, embodies consumption and decay. Mining is inherently a consumptive act, taking finite resources, whereas Artemis protects the wild, untamed, and renewable. This could reflect private equity VCs, Artemis investing in sustainable or innovative ventures as a contrast to Saturn's mining of finite, established resources. Example myth. Artemis protects nature fiercely, and in the myth of Actaeon, she kills the hunter who violated her sacred wilderness. This story could parallel Artemis's clash with Saturn mining forces when unsustainable practices encroach on her domain. Framework idea. Artemis, private equity/VCs, and Saturn, mining, represent competing ideologies. Artemis symbolizes investment in renewal and innovation, while Saturn represents consumption of existing resources. When they clash, it's a battle between sustainable growth, Artemis, and extractive profit models, Saturn. Hint 2. Artemis and Hades, legal apparatus, democracy. Artemis and Hades do interact indirectly in myths where death and the underworld touch her domain. Orion's death. In one version of the myth, Artemis is tricked into killing her hunting companion, Orion, who is later placed among the stars. Hades' underworld becomes Orion's resting place before he ascends to the heavens. This reflects how Artemis's decisions, investments, in your framework, might unintentionally lead to consequences that fall under Hades' jurisdiction, legal apparatus. Iphigenia at Aulis. Artemis demands the sacrifice of Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia, to appease her wrath. In some versions, Artemis saves Iphigenia at the last moment and spirits her away to the land of the Taurians. This story involves a moral and legal tension, a human sacrifice sanctioned by gods, which could symbolize private equity/VCs, Artemis navigating legal structures, Hades to protect their interests. Themes and connections. Protection and boundaries. Artemis protects her domain, but when people violate her laws, their actions lead to death or punishment, aligning with Hades' role in enforcing justice. In your framework, Artemis, private equity VCs, must navigate legal structures, Hades, to pursue her goals, while Hades ensures fairness or enforces consequences. Innovation versus regulation. Artemis's wild, untamed spirit contrasts with Hades' rigid structures. Venture capitalists, Artemis, often challenge legal frameworks to innovate, while Hades ensures compliance. Their dynamic mirrors the push and pull between disruptive innovation and institutional stability. 3. Artemis, Saturn, and Hades together. While there's no myth where all three interact directly, we can craft a thematic synergy. The clash of cycles. Artemis, private equity VCs, represents renewal and long-term vision. Saturn, mining, embodies short-term resource extraction, and Hades, legal apparatus, maintains the systems that mediate between them. Conflict and cooperation. Artemis and Saturn may clash over how to use resources, sustainably or destructively, while Hades acts as the referee, enforcing the laws of the land. Artemis must operate within Hades' cell frameworks while resisting Saturn's exploitative tendencies. Possible mythic reinterpretation. Imagine Artemis as a protector of nature's bounty, Saturn as the miner seeking to exploit it, and Hades as the arbiter of justice. Artemis lays claim to a pristine wilderness full of hidden treasures, resources ripe for investment. Saturn seeks to mine these treasures, disregarding Artemis's careful stewardship. Hades intervenes to mediate the conflict, as imposing rules that both must follow, balancing innovation and resource extraction with legal oversight. Does this thematic approach work for your framework? Or would you prefer I dive deeper into specific myths to refine the connections further?
You brought Francis Bacon to my mind and his book about ancient allegories. He makes Pan nature. I love that book and think I need to assign nature a thematic identity. And on impulse, I hear Stanley Milgram whisper in my ear, authority. As in my methodology, every detail contained within these myths are projections of the psyche, so they cannot be what they are on the surface to any degree. So we have effectively a new character I otherwise would have been oblivious to.